Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Everyone, welcome back to the show. I've got a great episode today, speaking with return Realignment guest, Katherine Boyle, who co-leads Andreessen Horowitz's American Dynamism practice. American Dynamism is an idea that's incredibly interesting, whether or not you're into startups, venture capital, or broader investing. It's one of many different answers to the specific problem we focused on with Mark, which is this: what happens when American society doesn't feel like it's growing, feels like it's stagnating, feels like there's all these different challenges that can't be answered by the public sector or by a broken political system. So would love to hear what you guys think about American dynamism, about the broader frame, and whether or not it actually has the possibility for saving as a broader framework for addressing, once again, broader problems in American society beyond just technology and startups. Quick note, would love for anyone who has not checked it out yet to go subscribe to the Realignment's Supercast. This is actually the last day of the second quarter of the year. We're a little ahead of the goal we had originally, but would love to get any additional subscribers to check out our bonus work. All that's here. And if you're new, definitely click subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You can probably tell we're starting to get a bit of traction here and would love to keep that up. Here's the full episode. Katherine Boyle, welcome back to the Realignment.
It's always great to be here. Thanks so much.
We were just chatting before the episode. You've done a lot of podcasts recently, so I hate to ask you this first question. It's the most obvious question. What is American dynamism?
Yeah, no, I don't mind getting this question over and over again. But so I recently joined Andreessen Horowitz to co-lead a practice we're calling American Dynamism, which the simplest definition we use is companies that are supporting the national interest. It sounds very broad. It's everything from aerospace and defense, these sort of classical, sectors that sell directly to government, but also things like national security, public safety, housing, education. When you think about the things that all Americans care about, most Americans care about where their kids are going to school. They care about the fact that they want to live in a safe neighborhood. All of these things that touch every American. We very much believe that technology can help solve these problems. And so our view is that, these companies have in some ways historically been ignored by Silicon Valley. It's not a place where, these are robust sectors. A lot of them are very, old school sectors, legacy sectors. And we very much believe that new technology can be brought into these physical spaces in order to help the country. So it's really the companies that see themselves in support of building for the national interest.
Yeah. So two questions come out of that. I'll ask one, and you could answer the other. What is the national interest? Like, how do we as a society come to agree on what that is? I was reading and listening to a couple of the podcasts you did, and you made reference to, hey, like we spent $6 trillion on failed nation building programs. If we were to go back in time and record this in 2002, I could easily see someone saying these programs are in the national interest. So how do you just think about even the use of that word?
Yeah, no, I love this question because I think it's the things we broadly agree on. I recently wrote a piece. It was actually I wrote it for Barry Weiss's Common Sense, and it's called The Case for American Seriousness. And I wrote it on a Friday evening where I was pretty despondent about what was happening in Ukraine. I just sort of sat down and started furiously typing on my my laptop, and I was just thinking through all of the things that we've done over the last few decades that really don't support what I hear people wanting on the ground. And what you and I, talk about, what people talk about is, okay, why don't we have a government that works? Why don't we have schools that work? I think COVID in some ways illuminated all of the things that aren't working in this country. And so I sort of, enumerated the things that I think aren't serious. I don't think it's a serious country if the people we can trust are only stand-up comedians and we don't have broad trust in institutions anymore. I think, spending trillions of dollars on failed nation building is not where most people want to see tax dollars going to when we have, failing schools, when we have examples of things that just weren't working inside the country over the last few years. And so I think the national interest is broadly making sure that these things that most Americans care about, and I would say, we talk about housing, education, healthcare. These are, three massive parts of the American economy. And yet, we'd say 40, 50 years ago, people had access to these things. If you were, middle class, that was sort of the thing that you could achieve was a great education, great healthcare, a house, a roof over your family's head. And now I think that the middle class, that's actually a struggle. And so our view is that technology can certainly help in these sectors, and that we need to see more investment in these sectors in order to make sure that we are supporting the national interest and the things that most Americans care about.
I love how you just had a pretty straightforward framework for national interest equals things that most people agree on. There are plenty of examples of things that you and I may support, but we could also agree there might not exactly be a national consensus on that issue. And that's just as helpful because it's really frustrating for me when people just sort of assert without a framework, this thing is this thing. Like the example of this for me is student loan debt. Regardless of how people feel about this issue, you'll hear people say student loan debt is the generational issue for millennials. And you just say, well, from a mathematical perspective, only a third of millennials even went to college. So how could it possibly be this like generational thing? So I like it when there's just a framework there. So something I'm curious about, I told you this anecdote before the episode started, is I was speaking to a tech journalist a few weeks ago who will go nameless. I'll use a they, them pronoun in this case because it'll actually be helpful. I was speaking with them and they just, apropos of nothing, said, hey, have you seen what A16Z is doing with American Dynamism? I unironically think that's a very cool thing. Now, as you know, as a former journalist, I would say that tech journalists are not exactly the most optimistic and sunny bunch. It's a part of the industry, good faith, bad faith. It's going to be kind of jaded. So hearing someone say this is very cool was actually kind of surprising to me. I'm curious why you think a journalist would have come away with that conclusion about the story you're telling. I have my own answer, but I'm curious what your just immediate reaction to why this would be.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would love to hear your answer first, but I'd say, there are people who I think when we first announced the practice went into it thinking this would be extremely controversial in some way. It's like you hear the word America or you see the American flag, and there are people who instinctively think that this is going to be a controversial thing. And then when you actually read, okay, why are we doing this? It's because we've seen in our own portfolio that these sectors, they're harder to build in, but you can build massive businesses here. So it's not it's not what is it? It's not impact investing. There's a lot of, I think, people who would say, is this a new form of ESG? It's certainly not a new form of ESG. It's the opposite of that. Like, we very much believe that the largest and most important companies can be built in this sector. But I think the reason why people or think it's cool. I mean, I love hearing that someone, unironically said that, is because people know these are big problems. And I think there is an understanding, especially coming out of the last few years, that anyone who is willing to solve these problems, like, we welcome all problem solvers. Like there used to even be a debate on who's allowed to solve the biggest problems in this country. I'd say a few years ago, it was like, do we even want the tech sector to be focused on these things? Because it's like, no, that's the domain of government, or that's the domain of the nonprofit sector. And we do not want those icky tech people involved. And I think when things get so complex and so bad in many cases, people are like, you know what? Anyone who's got a shovel, just come here and build. And so I hope that's the way it's being received. I certainly see that in the people that I'm meeting with, that people are just fed up waiting for solutions and they want to dig in and build.
Yeah. And as you said, in a bunch of different contexts, your desired end state is that every venture capital firm has an American Dynamism practice. Yeah. And my answer to why this just resonates is that, like you said, with the debate no longer being about, can these tech people even get into this space? It's not 2013 anymore. Yeah. In 2013, I think that's back when you were still in DC. In 2013, I think it's possible, whether or not you agree with the conclusion, to say, hey, we actually think that government can function. Government could take these projects on. Government took us to the moon. I just don't want the private sector to do that. Yeah. In a world where almost 10 years later, it's very easy to conclude whether or not that would be the right desired end state. It's just not up for grabs. Yeah. I think I don't know if you guys are doing stuff with climate tech, but I think there's a really strong American dynamism case for climate tech. And I could see a world where you say to yourself, let's say you're at a fund that focuses more on that space. You know what? You're not going to have comprehensive climate legislation pass in the next decade, no matter what. That is not a consensus issue. Therefore, if you take this issue seriously, like let's say John Doerr does, you need incredible aggressive investments into the space to produce technological change. And I think a lot of people who think about this structurally just have that in mind. So they see American dynamism as a category, regardless of how you are implementing it, as a response to a problem.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, it's the other thing that I like to remind people is that, we used to have a robust functioning government that would invest in different types of technologies, that there was sort of, there's been a lot of discussion about industrial policy. Like there was a lot of investment in research and development. I think that what has happened with venture capital, whether people like it or not, is that it has become, it's no longer this niche asset class of people in Northern California investing in little tech companies that then become massive. I mean, it really is the dominant structure for how innovation happens, not only in the US, but we've exported this structure to the world. So it's sort of like it or not, this is how we do innovation. This is how we take bets. There's always, throughout history, there's been models of patronage. And when you look back through various epochs, it's like there have been people who've invested in different types of innovations or innovators. And, oftentimes like that was less structured. But now we have this structured and robust asset class that exists everywhere in the world. That was not the case 10 years ago, but now it exists everywhere in the world. That is how innovation gets done. And so instead of kind of fighting against like whether that's good or bad, I mean, we can have that sort of, conversation. It's like, this is just the way it is. And so the question is, do we want to keep investing in the virtual world, which, my argument has been in the last 10 years, there was a lot of focus on the virtual world because it is easier, it is easier to build in the virtual world. There's less regulation. It's sort of, it's land grab. There's ways to build in the virtual world with pure software where it makes more sense from an economic perspective of how you scale. Versus the physical world, I just think right now, so many founders, and the reason why we built this practice is not because we were looking for the next thing. It's like we're hearing it on the ground from founders. So many founders are seeing the problems with the physical world, especially when there was a global display of that in 2020, saying, I want to build for the physical and I want to bring technology, I want to bring software into the physical world. So in some ways, I think that the good that will come out of this sort of global experiment we had with COVID is that so many people are now looking at their own communities, looking at what went wrong and saying, I want to solve these big problems because we have to.
Yeah, that's a good pivot to the two foundational spaces as pieces and how A16Z is thinking about this. So you are referencing the virtual world. That brings to mind Mark Andreessen's Software is Eating the World Wall Street Journal essay from a little over 10 years ago. I'd love you just to basically explain what software is eating the world. What was it saying? What did it mean? And how did the next 10 years play out according to that framework?
Yeah, well, so I mean, and I would encourage people to go back and read the original essay. I mean, what I love about what we do in venture capital is like, the companies he mentioned, the things that he mentioned. I mean, it was so directionally poignant. And the software is eating the world. What it said is that, software is entering every industry. And industry isn't the right word. It's like every sector of our life. When you think about what do you do today that doesn't involve software? I mean, I'm looking even around my office and I'm like, there's books. Okay, well, I read books on my phone. You get into your car, it's all software now. I mean, if you have a Tesla, it's a driving computer. So there's no aspect of our lives now that isn't dominated by software. And the only aspect, and this is part of the impetus for why we started really talking about American Dynamism, and Mark touches on this in It's Time to Build. The only aspect of our lives that are not dominated by software are the sectors that are dominated by government. Are the sectors that are crushed by regulation. Think of housing regulation. I used to live in San Francisco. Now I live in Florida. And when I lived in San Francisco, I mean the conversation, and it's still the conversation of the day, is just how housing will never be built in San Francisco. And that is not because people do not know how to build houses. It is because of extreme regulation that prevents people from building. We're actually very good at building houses. Like there's been tremendous gains in construction over the last 50 years. And the reason why we are not able to build more housing for people in cities where there is just such an extraordinary demand, where people would pay for more housing, where you actually could build standalone houses or new structures, is because it is so difficult to get things through city government and through city regulations. And so I think the view that we have is that these sectors are really hard because there is so much regulatory capture, because there are so many things that don't exist in the virtual world. But because the problem has gotten so bad and because there's so much focus, the next 10, 20 years of building generally is going to be entering these sectors that really haven't been touched by software yet. And that's everything from, the government, I'd say government broadly, whether it's GovTech or whether it's defense tech. There's other structural reasons why software and artificial intelligence haven't necessarily entered those sectors. We can talk a lot about that. But the interesting thing about this sector is that there are different reasons for every aspect of what we're looking at, but they're all touched by the fact that there's been regulatory capture, that these are massive markets, and that there are ways to build and to bring software in that will actually make them much more affordable and much more functional for most Americans.
So something I'm curious about, given the story you just told, we could basically treat American Dynamism in these public focused sectors as like the last frontier of software eating the world. It did it to taxis, it did it to hotels, it changed Hollywood. Now government is this, and government related areas is this last area where nothing's happened. Well, so nothing's happened yet, but it's not to its logical conclusion. Yeah. Why then does every venture firm not have an American dynamism focused practice then? If this is, because it seems to me that this is the easiest LP pitch of all time. Software 99 out of 100 things, we're focused on that last one thing, we'll make a lot of money there. Why isn't that basically causing the whole industry to change?
Because it's hard. It's hard. But I also think like, every firm will, it's, you can always look back and say, well, why didn't these, like SaaS wasn't an actual category, 15 years ago. It wasn't like there were, SaaS focused firms.
Sorry, we're a non-tech audience. You explain what SaaS is.
Software as a service. So like, think of consumer, like there are games funds now, companies that are, or firms that are solely focused on investing in gaming. That didn't exist before. What I think people miss about venture capital is that we are so early in the story of venture capital. And the story of how it yields American innovation, but also global innovation. And so what I think even I've witnessed in my career, and I've been investing for almost a decade now, is just the extraordinary like professionalization and the movement towards sectors that historically were ignored. So I think we're in, I often say, we're 30 years into the story of the internet. Like if you look at like the story of the Renaissance, I mean, that's a 150, 200 year epic. And you're looking at right now, which I would argue is probably when we look back, millennia from now, or when our ancestors look back, or our children look back, millennia from now, like what they are going to be saying is this was a unique period of time, but it was a long period of time. And so we are in early innings. And I think like the idea of government being the last frontier, I don't know that it's the last frontier, but it's certainly a frontier. And I do think that there have been just extraordinary changes that have allowed for new companies to enter the sector that wouldn't have been able to enter before. One of the things that I've pointed out a lot is like, it takes someone like an Elon Musk or a Palmer Luckey, Elon being someone who really pioneered new space, Palmer Luckey being, the founder of Anduril, which is, I would say the company that has the most extraordinary chance of changing the defense industry. And you look at these founders and it's like they really had to run against a wall. And what will happen is there will be founders that ride in their wake. And that's a great thing that happens throughout every type of, building new types of technologies or building new types of industries. So I think that the work that has been done by these early companies, SpaceX, Palantir, Anduril, will lead to a entirely new crop of defense tech and gov tech companies that are now able to work in a way that say they wouldn't have been able to work in 10 years ago.
It's funny, quick side note, but I picked up from listening to your episodes. I'm happy you referenced how long you've actually been investing, because there's this trope of saying Katherine Boyle, former journalist, but to your point, you've reiterated many times that at this point you've been an investor longer than you actually ever were a journalist. So yeah. I made sure not to add a question about that.
No, it's more become my fun fact of what makes me interesting. But I can't claim to know anything about modern journalism anymore. Like now I'm at the point where when I was a journalist, I mean, gosh, it was over a decade ago, and it's like I'm a dinosaur. Like nothing that is happening in modern journalism looked anything like what I was doing when I was writing at the Washington Post. I will concede that.
The debate wasn't over, do you go to Substack? The debate was, do you go over to BuzzFeed or not?
Yeah, there was no Slack. There was no internal.
Yeah, just like not like it's once again to your point. It's a fun fact that I'll put in your bio. It's not a whole section of a conversation, which is just funny to think about. But this is good too, because this takes us to the second foundational piece that, as you've stated, played a huge role in thinking about this practice of American Dynamism specifically. Mark Andreessen's Time to Build essay that came out during the earliest part of COVID. Would love a great just summary of that piece for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like I just can't do justice to Mark's words because he's such a talented writer, which I think people know instinctually because he speaks in paragraphs, and I'm excited you'll have a conversation with him. But it was just the recognition that like here we are in COVID, and we're the greatest country in the world, and like why can't we manufacture tests? Like why is it that like like he'll talk about the reason why, and this was a moment for him where it's like he just sat down and furiously started typing as well, because it's like why is it that New York City when, we're a month and a half into COVID, is asking for people to bring ponchos because they've run out of PPE. Like, why is it that like the greatest city in the world that like people want to traverse the world to get to? Why were we having so much problems as a country? Like that we couldn't manufacture our own tests, we couldn't manufacture our own protective, our own PPE. Like what was it about? Like why is it that we are not able to manufacture and build anymore? And so it's time to build was just this call to arms. An extraordinary call to arms that said, like, it is time for us to get back to learning how to do physical things again, learning how to build with our hands, learning how to manufacture in this country, solving problems, getting back to a problem-solving ethos. I mean, I think, Mark kind of touches on this in the piece, but it's like, this is not like a political gamesmanship thing. Both sides had issues with this during COVID. Both sides have issues with this in a lot of, a lot of the issues that we're upset about as a country. Why is it that we can't just start building again? And so I think like the thing that we've said as part of American Dynamism that's really important is that building is a political philosophy in and of itself. It's not like a progressive thing or a conservative thing. Just choosing to stop whining, choosing to stop arguing, choosing to stop participating in a culture war and put your hands down and actually start building from the ground up is actually a philosophy in and of itself. And our view, I think, is that if more people do that, if more people just decide to take sort of matters into their own hands and solve some of these problems, which start out as oftentimes small companies and become large companies that are solving big, thorny problems, that'll actually be really good for the country. And that ethos of just putting your hands down and building is actually something that we need to get back to versus sniping on Twitter.
Yeah, and I think the whole articulation of building as a political philosophy that doesn't track left or right is a really interesting one. I think the one bit of nuance that I'd be curious about pushing you on, because you've discussed this, is there are still people who are anti-building
yes.
in the way it's implemented, and they're anti-left. There are right-wing NIMBYs, there are left-wing NIMBYs, there are centrist NIMBYs. So could you speak? Let's just start with good faith. Could you speak to people who have critiques of just like this idea of like building more? So for example, some of the most articulate people who are against building, let's say new housing, but I know some of my friends in DC will say things like, look, like at a core level, I get that housing is a severe issue in this country. At the same time, like I don't like the idea of someone installing a multiplex housing unit in my nice suburban leafy neighborhood. Like that's a opinion that I have what a neighborhood looks like. We all agree on it. That's like democracy. So can you just speak to people who are anti-building, but not just cronyism, just like they're skeptical of it?
Well, so it's interesting because I think, that argument is usually, a personal, like, I like the character of my neighborhood and I'm, but I think there's a broader, deeper argument that I think makes me more nervous, which is the anti-growth argument. And it's an it's the same people who will say, don't have children because it's really harmful for the environment. Or, we shouldn't change the way that we're living. It's sort of an anti-change, anti-growth, anti-family. I mean, one of the things that I've constantly felt is that like a lot of the people who are very anti-technology are the same people who are anti-family, and those are strange bedfellows. In Washington, like you usually don't see the people who are very pro-technology seeming like they're pro-family, but now you're finally seeing that in Elon Musk. I think it comes from something deeper, which is the sense of nihilism and the sense of destruction, which is that like the world will never be good again. America will never be great again. In fact, America is bad. And it's the same people who say, okay, like, yeah, we can't build anymore. We can't solve our own problems. It's wrong to bring a child into this world because their life is going to be worse than yours. It's a nihilistic viewpoint. And it's one that I actually think is probably the most dangerous cultural phenomenon that's happening in this country, where there's a belief that you can't take matters into your own hands and actually build because you've been systematically oppressed. You've been systematically put into a world that it's only declining. And I just think that's completely wrong. It's actually hard to argue against it because so many of those views are these emotional sort of, it's sort of anti-progress. It's anti-human is how I would argue it. And so I actually think it's quite dangerous and quite hard to argue against just because so many people are so attached to that nihilistic viewpoint.
And something that comes to mind that I'm curious about, and this speaks to time to build and this broader theme. What are the limits of technology when it comes to affecting these overall changes? In the sense of how much of, let's say, like housing stagnation or just a lot of these different issues are the fact that, we haven't developed the quickest way of like manufacturing a cheap but very safe and structurally nice home versus, hey, like there's this regulation over, let's say, zoning in the region. Like, how do you think this really balances out?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, this is a sector we're really spending a lot of time on. I was just having a conversation with a founder who was pointing out that like prefab homes have actually had a long history in America. They're actually branded very poorly. And that,
Understatement of the century.
Yeah. But when you look at other countries like Australia, for example, they've really embraced prefab. They've really embraced being able to build, very quickly in a way that like America just hasn't. And so it's like, how do we actually encourage? And I do think it has a lot to do with branding in some cases. It's like, how do we say that prefab is actually a great thing and that actually it's safe, it's reliable, it's sexy? I mean, you see a lot of these kind of new ADU companies, accessory dwelling unit companies coming out with very beautiful modern designs. And yes, they're prefabbed homes, but they're beautiful. And so in some ways, I think technology when in dealing with these types of very regulated environments can only go so far. And I do think in some ways like technology will be the broader solution to a lot of these problems. But like this is why we also say there has to be sort of a conversation with government. And maybe that's like the naive part of me because, I think the old school Washington part of me, like having lived in Washington a long time is like, okay, these conversations never happen. Like it's very zero sum. But I do think like you get to a certain point where, everyone has good intentions and wants to make sure that these problems are solved. And I do think we're getting to this point where, I see it in a number of sectors where there is a conversation happening. Silicon Valley is working very closely with government on a variety of issues. Defense is the place where I've seen the most, I would say, enthusiasm. But it's like tech is no longer, I'd say, the bad guy in a lot of these conversations. And I think that's the change that needs to happen. And of course, I want to hear your perspective on that because I know I know you might have differing opinions on whether Washington is looking at some of technologies, the good things that technology can do.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. This is that, yeah, like my background. So this is my favorite topic. This is one of those issues where, and this is why I'm bullish on American Dynamism to the start of the conversation because there just isn't a choice. There isn't an alternative, and basically so for example, like let's put aside like the debates about like antitrust and like tech regulation. No matter what, those debates have basically reached an impasse. There are some like, I'm sure like Josh Hawley and Amy Klobuchar can agree on like advertising within Instagram in this very specific context. They're advancing a bill on that. But to the broad, big DC debates, it's just not going there because of the lack of consensus on the issues. So the reason why I think this is going to have to move from a conversation, because I love how you've made that reference, because the most exhausting thing about spending time in DC think tank worlds or journalism where I've spent my time is you just can see, wait a second, someone was having this conversation, quote unquote, back in 1998 using the same exact language. So how much is this like a conversation or how much is that a euphemism for actually the status quo is pretty nice in Northern Virginia, which is usually what the secret is. But the point is, because the tech regulation conversation has just reached an endpoint, regardless of specific individual policies people support, you are going to have something new fill the void because these problems need to be addressed. So it's just like that table. It's just because this, and this is like a question I was going to ask you later, but I think a big way of summing up so much of what's happened the past few months and even since COVID is that stakes are back. So like high stakes. Like I spoke to Francis Fukuyama on the podcast last month, and history is back. And I think it's one thing to have this conversation when it feels like it's, once again, 2013, Obama got reelected, everything's pretty chill, versus today. So I'm just curious how you think about the idea of stakes, or like the stakes were always there, and that's like the dirty little secret, but it now viscerally feels like stakes are back.
Totally. And not only in Washington, but also in Silicon Valley. So like I was just listening to a great conversation with one of my founders, Palmer Luckey, who's the founder of Anduril. He was on a different podcast talking about how history has returned. And what's interesting is he was, reflecting on the fact that 2017, when he founded Anduril, it was very, very controversial for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons was because even insinuating that we were going to have ground wars or that there would be any sort of, hot conflict across the world, or that the nation state is still an important thing to talk about, was controversial in Silicon Valley. Like that was so passé. It was like, who are these people who still think that countries matter? And in some ways, it's like I think what Ukraine has done and shown is that like history has returned, and we can debate whether Francis Fukuyama actually was making that argument.
He wasn't, but
but a lot of people interpret it as such.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways, as you said, stakes are back in Washington. Like people actually have to perform now. It's the same thing for Silicon Valley. I think like for a long time there was sort of this we're living in a in a pure utopia, and all of the old rules don't matter, and that probably led people to work on the things that they thought were important, and that was of course and a lot of those companies became just generationally important companies, but I would say at the risk of perhaps not looking at some of the issues that were sort of hidden under the surface. And so I do think a return to stakes is an interesting way to put it, but it's almost like it's a return to just like, what are the important values that people care about? Like, what are the things that matter to most people? And I think if, going through COVID did show us that like what our kids are learning in school is so important, and how our kids are learning and how they've fallen behind. I mean, this is a problem that we're going to have to deal with for the rest of our lives, is this 2-year period where children just weren't educated in this country. Same thing with, there's an endemic, and it's like now people are really focused on, okay, what's going to happen with the next one? Like, how are we going to manage as a country? Like not only on policies, but like, how are we going to actually be able to operationalize some of this care? Like, so healthcare has become so much more important, I think, to people, in terms of, especially if we're expecting these things to happen routinely. I think in some ways it was just something that conveniently we lived in sort of a rosy environment where a lot of the best technologists didn't have to focus on these issues. And that's just not going to be the case. I was listening to some previous podcasts of people you've hosted, and it's like, do we think the next decade is going to be hard, or do we think it's going to be easier than the previous decade? And it's like, perhaps 2019 might actually be the year where everything changed and we go into this sort of chaos. And that means that we're going to need technologists who can function in that kind of chaos and actually make things that are tangibly important better versus just focusing on the virtual.
Man, I love the phrasing of technologists who could function in this chaos, because it brings to mind, a founder that y'all have invested in, Ryan Peterson, Flexport. And I'm once again, I'm speaking to your half of your VC side, half of your DC side. I am fascinated by political performance in, once again, periods of upheaval and chaos. So something I just did not understand, I've asked this to a bunch of journalists and they haven't given me a convincing answer, is I don't understand why Pete Buttigieg was not in the LA harbor with Ryan Peterson. It was really interesting how Ryan was like, John, once again, like put aside Flexport as a company, like Ryan was like, getting into it, like engaging, like writing these threads. And it's just like so fascinating to me that there's all this talk of like, oh, politicians have like mastered like Instagram and they have all these like audiences, but there still are just these gaps. And it just seems, so I'm curious how you think, separate from like an evaluation of Pete Buttigieg's like policy performance, how you're seeing founders in this space perform when they're talking about these issues. Because I don't know, like I watch, Chris from Hadrian talk about space, and I'm like, man, like you could be a NASA administrator. Not in the sense that like he could get through the confirmation process, but you have a way of articulating this issue and your deep knowledge and interest in the issue, especially the American side of the interest, in a way that I think would give people confidence. And to your point, when you've written about this, institutional trust is important. I think there's actually a lot that DC based folks could actually learn from founders in your portfolio space. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I love this line of questioning, because I don't think problem solvers go into politics anymore. And there's a reason for that. I think there's a lot of like, we have to remember that like 50 years ago, there was no competition for talent in America. Like people believed in public service. I've written about this a lot. I think everything changed in 1973 with the revocation of the draft. I'm not advocating that we go back to a draft, but I think it changed the culture of you have to serve your country. And so I think at the same time, venture capital was coming up, these sorts of financialization was happening. And so a lot of people who were privileged decided to go work on Wall Street in the 80s and the 90s, or work for McKinsey, or work in these jobs where they get the same sort of status and kudos that they would have gotten if they had worked in the government or run for office. And so I think now you have competition for talent. And there isn't the same sort of public service ethos. So a lot of the people who would have gone in and said, okay, I want to solve the biggest problem that I can, and I'm going to run, I'm going to run for governor, or I'm going to, become a member of Congress and work my way up there and solve problems. Like the most talented people get so frustrated now by the zero-sumness of Washington that they know that they can build a company on the other side of the country, theoretically, because these companies are built everywhere, but they don't have to build in Washington. They can solve these problems outside with building a venture-backed company, or maybe even not building a venture-backed company, just having actual physical impact in the world by building a business. And so I think that's why you see a lot of people, and also they have a megaphone now. So this is the other thing where it's like, Ryan Peterson might have existed 20 years ago as a very policy-minded business person, but like he didn't have a megaphone. He would have gone to a back door in California and said, hey, I can help here, I can help there. Like, how can I help you figure out the crisis? But like, he wouldn't have been able to just go direct with his message. So I think what we're seeing is that like a lot of the best problem solvers in this country actually are founders of companies. And I do think there is some of a backlash around that because Washington doesn't work that way. Washington is very much a place where maybe some people will step on the, step at the bully pulpit and say something, but it actually takes consensus and compromise to get things done. With CEOs can usually just make a decision themselves to get things done. So it's just there's different incentive structures. And the thing that I try to stress when I'm talking, in my own little pocket of, founders and CEOs is that like, it's not that the two groups are like, one group is bad, one group is good, or vice versa. It's just that there's just different incentives and different ways of getting things done. And the process has gotten really bad. We can make the arguments that yes, like legislation just doesn't get passed anymore in DC. But like the difference is like the speed and acceleration at which technology is allowing companies to grow, allowing people to make decisions, and just allowing for change is now so disparate from the slowness of how major decisions are made in Washington. And so I think that contrast, especially on display every day via Twitter or via whatever, media you're watching, is sort of why there's just this view that these worlds are just too different. And they are. I mean, like, that these worlds didn't necessarily exist on display 40 years ago.
I've heard you give the example of, certain people don't want to go into politics anymore, but I had a very vivid illustration of this. I did this episode with this journalist, Andrew Rice, earlier in the month, and his book is about the year 2000 and the 2000 election. And he has a very flattering portrait of Al Gore. Once again, let's put aside the joke about Al Gore claiming he invented the internet. He didn't technically do that, much like with Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. But Al Gore in the 80s was fascinated by technology. He was a good writer. Like the reason why he was able to even make the adjacent claim is that he was a congressman who was interested in the information superhighway and how tech could transform government. My bet is if he were 32 years old today, the son of a senator, Harvard graduate, always resources, I would bet he'd be a venture capitalist. And I actually bet he'd be probably pretty good at it. I think he'd actually be the type of person who would actually do well in your practice. So that was just, I was just thinking, I was like, man, like, if it's the year 2020, I think that he probably goes into a different sector than just being a member of Congress today. So I just can't stop thinking about that example.
Yeah, anecdotally, yeah. So this is super interesting. We were both at a conference for heretics, which shall remain nameless, but a conference for people who are think differently. And it was supposed to be a place where you can say whatever you're thinking, and there would be, and it was very much it was a great 2-day conversation about things that it was sort of understanding that you can say whatever you want and there will not be backlash. And so you ask one, you'd be in a group of 5 or 6 people and you'd ask a question and you'd get like 7 different answers. Like people would just be all over the map and you'd be like, wow, that's a really interesting way to interpret that question. And so I went around for the conference and just started asking people. And these are young technologists, young innovators, thinkers, people who are very online. I asked everyone, would you run for office? And not a single person there. And I probably talked to like 100, 150 people about this question. Not a single person said they would run for office. It was the only thing that people agreed on. These are supposed to be contrarians and heretics and people that will spar. And it was like, no. They all agree, like, we are not running for office. And I think that says something about incentives. It says something about what a society prizes. It says something about what technologists prize too. And I actually think that's something dangerous about the community that I'm in, that like no one wants to make that sacrifice because it's too painful, or the stress you'll put your family through, or the stress you'll put yourself through on Twitter, whatever it is. Like there's such a frustration with how things get done in Washington that people don't even want to engage. And that is extremely dangerous for a country where the best and the brightest do need to be engaged in making policy.
And this actually speaks to what my next question was going to be. There's the very obvious, what does DC need to learn from Silicon Valley? And that would be technology, like all the obvious things that we pat ourselves on the back on. But something you spoke about, I think it was, it may have been with when you did the audio essay for Barry Weiss. You talked about how Silicon Valley is like very positive sum versus DC is zero sum. Mm-hmm. And that to me just really struck out as a very important thing that, I guess, to think out loud for a second, it's so awkward right now because given inflation, given the concerns about like deficit spending, DC's instinct to be very, very, very zero sum. There's only so much of the pie. Once again, putting aside like specific policies that we use to handle inflation and spending and stimulus aside, there's literal zero sum, but there's also like mindset zero sum, which I think DC needs to learn from. And I can imagine being a tech founder, I would hate to go from a world of positive sum, we can do additive things, to that constraining bit. So can you talk about the mind? Let's put aside like the fiscal constraint side. What does the mindset side of zero sum versus positive sum look like?
Sure. Yeah. No. And when I say this, I mean it as the games that people are playing. And I use the game, I use the word game. These are serious issues, but really it is, if you think of it, if you think of how you operate in DC as a strategy game or how you build a company as a strategy game, there's different incentives. And so DC, the games are fixed. It's every 2 to 4 years. There will be an election. It is zero sum, and that someone will win and someone will lose. So you can't have two winners in an election. There has to be someone who takes power and someone who loses power. And so when you are in a zero sum setting, you operate very differently. You operate to win. And there can only be one winner. There's a fixed timeline when the winner will be announced. So it's very fixed. And that goes on and on and on and on. And so, I often say, like, everyone knows they're either going to be in office in November or they're going to go to a think tank. There's sort of a revolving door of that in Washington. Mm-hmm. A lot of people lose their jobs every 2 years. I think some people in Silicon Valley don't even realize that people are losing their jobs every 2 to 4 years in DC. And that's like part of the game. That's part of the process. And everyone knows that. And so people operate instinctually to win a zero-sum game where there is only one winner in an election. The opposite is true in Silicon Valley in that it is a positive sum game. Whereas if Uber is doing really well in the markets, it doesn't mean that Airbnb is not going to do well. Like, there can be many, many companies doing well in a sector. Yes, some sectors are winner take all, and you could say that there's fierce competition within sectors. But in my world, where we're making many investments across different sectors, you are rooting for companies and many people to win. And so you see a very different way of operating in the ecosystem of Silicon Valley than you do in DC. In DC, there's like a strong hierarchy, like only one person is going to be chief of staff. Like you have to work your way up the hierarchy in order to win. In Silicon Valley, anyone can build a company. And so the more shots that you take on goal, the more successful you will be. So like being really good at email is prized. Like doing lots of investments is prized. Having a large portfolio is prized. Like the more that you can do, the better. The more positive sum, the more like optimistic you can be. Like that's actually like you are incentivized to be optimistic. There's no incentive to be pessimistic in Silicon Valley. And so they're just very different ecosystems. And what I think actually makes it hard for Silicon Valley to understand how Washington works is, like, to your point, if you're used to just using abundance, like being able to use capital, being able to build things, to if you've had one successful exit, maybe you become a venture capitalist and you invest in many other companies, and then you just see more. If you're used to that, and then you go into a world where it's like you're only focused on one game, and that game you can easily lose, and you lose everything, like that, I think is a hard. It's a hard thing for people who are technologists to understand, like even just conceptually understand. And at its core, I think the incentive structure of Washington is power. Power is finite. There's always going to be, I use this example, but even in the media, when I was a reporter, everyone was trying to get on the front page. There's only one, story to dominate the news cycle every day. And so it's like, it's this constant running at, how do I get on the front page? How do I dominate the news cycle? There's only going to be one winner. Where on the flip side, like that's just not how Silicon Valley works. There's so many winners. And if you're in an abundance mentality, it's really hard to move to this fixed, okay, only one winner. And I have to now play a totally different game that I'm not used to, which is like being really cutthroat about power, being ruthless about hierarchy, making sure that no one cuts into my territory, making sure I'm on the front page and no one else can have the front page, because if I don't dominate the news cycle, I'm not going to win. Like these are very different cultures. The thing that I think is I actually think this is the structural problem that will make it very difficult for the two ecosystems to ultimately become very friendly.
Yeah, and I think, once again, this comes to my bull case for this entire conversation. I do think as stagnation sets in, that creates incentives for people to be anti-stagnation and to articulate these things in different ways. And someone I was thinking about during this entire conversation about Washington, I have a buddy who is soon to likely be a state representative in Oregon. He just watched Top Gun Maverick and was just like super jazzed coming out of it, right? Like It's so positive. The technology is great. It's very, very can-do. He bought a bunch of books about the Navy just to learn about that side of things. I'm curious, what would and this doesn't just apply to my friend, this applies to basically any young person who's thinking about politics, who has made that choice of direction to go in. Like, what is your advice for how they should just think about these spaces from their end? Because to your point earlier, there's the tech side of this, but there is also the governance side, no matter what happens.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I love hearing that you have a friend who just like was inspired by a positive story and is now like, I'm going to live my life this way. And I think that is what we need more of. Like the reason why I don't live in Silicon Valley anymore, why I moved, why I think like the best thing to happen to Silicon Valley is how distributed it's gotten, is that we have to change this positive sum. Like we have to make sure that this positive sum ecosystem that was, it was restricted to Northern California, restricted to certain small tech companies. We have to make sure that it touches every community in America, because it is the American spirit. It is like the future of this country, is people being convinced that if they work really, really hard and if they want to solve a problem, that they can. And what I think that Washington, unfortunately, is teaching us is the opposite of that, which is that like, if there is a problem, find a scapegoat. Like, don't take responsibility. Don't, there is a totally different instinct, I think, in elected office. And I'm not saying all of Washington. There's amazing people who work in government and who work for, give 10, 20, 30 years of public service. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the career people. I'm talking about the instinct to not own up to mistakes that I think Silicon Valley has this culture of like, you own up to mistakes every quarter. Every week, if you're talking to your employee, like you make a wrong decision, it is public and you fail very publicly. And I think we need to have a culture in this country where public failure is seen as a good thing, where owning up to your decisions is seen as a good thing. It's very much in vogue now to never apologize for anything. I think like you actually see more apologies by CEOs of tech companies for making wrong decisions because they have to, because it is always very public. And I think that is the culture that we need to make sure reaches more than just Silicon Valley, more than just people who are engineers, tinkering on certain projects, but reaches every sector and reaches every community in America. And so that's what I'm excited. Like the thing I'm most excited about that I just want to stress is like, this is not a movement. The American Dynamism movement is not a movement that's just happening in California. Like it is happening across the country for a reason. And like the distribution of tech, distribution of that sort of accelerated movement of building businesses and communities that have been ignored for the last 50, 60 years, that is going to change the game. So that's sort of what motivates me, is that this is not a California movement. This is an American movement.
And to the very specific language you use there, of touching every community, I know that you are actually from Florida. So moving to Miami isn't just, there's a little, obviously everyone should move to Miami if that's what your, jazz is, but you actually are from the States. Like I just moved to Austin. I'm technically from Houston. So I'm kind of in the same, I'm not actually in the same. I left after day 2. I was adopted. So I can't actually claim I'm a Texan, but sorry, you were saying?
No, but isn't that like, isn't it cool? Like that, to me, this is like the joy of the internet and the joy of this movement that is happening with distributed tech, distributed work, is like you can actually choose where you want to live. You can choose the community that you want to be a part of. And for so long, I just think if you were told this lie, if you were ambitious, if you were someone who, if you were someone who saw themselves as special, you had to leave your hometown, you had to leave your home state, you had to go to one of 3 cities in America, and you had to compete. And for me, it's like the joy coming out of COVID is that I can live where I want to. I can live close to my family. I can live in a state that I think represents my values. It's like I always loved Florida. It's like, why did I have to move to California and be in a place that never felt really authentic to who I am? So I think like coming out of COVID, we are going to just see this extraordinary distribution of tech that like actually leads to like a stronger federalist country. And we haven't seen the impact of that yet. Like 10 years from now, we will look back and we'll say the migration patterns, the fact that tech has enabled a stronger federalist country is actually like a very, very good thing. And we didn't have that, a few years ago.
So here's the question then. And this is less of an issue in your sector for a variety of like cultural reasons. But when you talk about touching every community, how does tech do that and distribute without being cringe? To put it like very, very concertedly. So for example, when I said this is less of an American dynamism issue, you could show up anywhere in the country and talk about space, and that's just awesome. You could talk about housing. I think there's something, but like, look, like, I'm not here to like dunk on Web3 folks, but I think it's one thing for Chris Power to show up in your community, is another thing for a bunch of like Bored Ape Yacht Club people to show up in your community. So like, how can tech think about distributing itself while also like, there's a reason why learn to code became like a pejorative the past few years. How should tech think about distributing itself while also not provoking backlash? Not to say it's always like deserved, but there is something cultural to it that I sympathize with.
So it's interesting. The learn to code thing, no one's going to listen to an MIT PhD who's like, oh, everyone can just learn to code and like life's going to be better. I think like one thing I've been really rough on the tech community on is like, we're not good storytellers, and our empathy for what it is like for the average American, it just hasn't been there. And so like this sort of like when average Americans are worried about automation and losing jobs, which has happened periodically throughout the last 10, 20 years, or they're worried about offshoring, they're worried about, oh, it'll just take care of itself, which we've heard for a very long time. Like the idea that a technologist can come in who knows nothing about their community and say, oh yeah, no, it's just going to be fine. Like you're all going to learn to code, or you're all going to learn new jobs. Like that should be a pejorative. It's not empathetic. It's not realistic. Like it is not a solution that is born of the community or of the people who are going to need that solution. But like on the flip side, like, and I think Hadrian is a perfect example of this, like the thing that Chris realized, and I think the thing that makes him different than a lot of other companies that have tried to automate factories before, and Hadrian is automating machine shops focused on the aerospace and defense sector, is that you need machinists from day one. And they need to be treated the same way that you would treat that PhD from MIT who's working on automation software. Like you need people working together to solve these problems, and you need to understand that the machinists are just as valuable. They are part of the solution. And that is where I think this next phase of people focused on really hard problems, like there's a greater understanding of either bringing the customer in the case of Anduril, where, the big innovation for Anduril, aside from many other, technical innovations and business model innovations, was that Anduril didn't talk down to its customer. Like it supported men and women in uniform, and it asked them, what are your needs? The founders of the company had true empathy for the people who were on the ground. And it wasn't, Silicon Valley is coming to save us. It wasn't this like absurd, we know your problem better than you, and therefore we're going to talk down to you, which I do think for a very long time, that has been Silicon Valley's sort of MO. Like that's just been sort of on a lot of problems. There has been just like a complete misunderstanding of what the rest of the country is. And so what I'm excited about is you see these founders who not only have true empathy, maybe they came from a community where they understand the problem or are finally like engaging with it in a way that's interesting. But there isn't sort of this, I can solve the problem for you. It's like, we can solve it together. And Andrew and Hadrian are perfect examples of that, where it's not talking down to the customer or trying to replace people who have been working in fields for decades, or in some case, where they have true understanding of what the customer needs.
No, and that's really great. And I think it gets to why I think this practice is so cool, because it's a mix of virtual, digital, and in real life. You actually can't abstract this away, and you actually have to understand that machine is dynamic. Like it's a very obvious joke, but it's a true joke. Like Mark Zuckerberg was not the life of the party. He did not need to understand like great Harvard frat social interaction to build like the most important social network of his generation. But that is not how this space works to the same degree. Like you have to the point of Andrew, you have to understand the DoD process. Like it's genuinely really interesting. So for the last two questions.
And just one point on that too.
Yeah.
The reason why Andrew is so interesting, I think this is like, 30% of the company are veterans or people who've worked in public service, who've worked in the military. Like that is so extreme for Silicon Valley. And it's like building the products together with people who've been on the ground, who not only speak to the warfighter, but were the warfighter. Like that is such a different model. And it means so much to see that like, veterans are actually building for the people who are serving. And so I think that is a difference. And that is something that I don't know that Washington has fully realized yet, but like the difference between companies that were built 10 years ago and companies being built right now is that there are more people who are truly empathetic to the work that is being done, who are involved in the process. And also, this is so important, getting equity. Like giving equity to people who are, it's not just the engineers anymore who are working in these companies and getting equity. Like, and I think that is what is so important that people haven't yet realized, is that like, if we can bring this model to every community across the country, this is going to be an extraordinary moment for growth in America.
So for the last two questions, we're going to do an episode of Paula G. Srinivasan about his new book, The Network State, in a couple of weeks. The core idea is basically, much as you exited the Bay Area, I exited the East Coast. The next level up from that, now that everything's virtual, is maybe exiting the United States. Maybe it's founding a new country. Maybe it's founding something virtual, without asking you to argue against biology, because different conceptions can exist in the same time. Why should someone, in the face of many, many libertarian-minded people saying the nation state is next when it comes to disruption, why should we have faith in the practice, which is not even the practice, but why should we still have confidence in the nation state?
So that's an interesting question. I'll go back to something you said, which is that I exited. And I feel very strongly about this, that I didn't exit. I was running towards something far greater than what California had to offer. And I firmly believe this. I think I'm early on the Florida train. I think we will look back in 30 years. And it's interesting. I point to this scene in Mad Men, which is one of my favorite shows, where Don Draper goes out from New York to California, and he says, "You won't believe it. Everything is new. It's clean. It's fresh." And I had the same sort of experience when I was leaving California and coming to Miami. It was like, everything is new. There's hope. And he says this, the people are filled with hope. And so in my view, part of what I was running towards, you could say I was exiting sort of this decay or stagnation or a city that wasn't functioning, but I was running towards a city that I truly believe embodies the best parts of America, which is people who've oftentimes, I mean, it's the city with the most foreign-born population, people who are, leaving something so that they can build something greater, oftentimes with very little on their backs. And people who will hustle and just like work hard and take pride in what they're building. And so I often look at my sort of move as not an exit, but a sort of an entrance into something that I think is going to be, one of the most extraordinary places. And it is already that, but is growing in terms of the people who are coming from tech and for business and for other reasons. In terms of like why the nation state is still important, we can have like theoretical debates about, can we build a city in the sky? Can we build, but at the end of the day, the hardest problems that we care the most about are managed by governments, and they're managed by state governments. Most people cannot, when you think about like the vast majority of Americans cannot afford private education, which is an exit from state education. The vast majority of Americans like can't afford, private healthcare, which is like, when you think about just all of the ways in which we already have this sort of exit model, it's like the vast majority of people are reliant on their government for certain civic functions. And I do think that tech can work with government to make those things better. But the idea that we are exiting a model of the nation state, which has existed, for a very long time, and like where especially this country has operated in a certain way in this long time. I think that is sort of it's a utopian ideal, and I'm happy that people are thinking about it. But like I'm really focused on sort of what's here and what's now and the problems that are immediate. I think futurism is really important. And I have so much respect for people who focus on the future and where it's headed, and sort of like 50 years from now, how will we be operating? We need those people. Like we should celebrate them. But I think a lot of the most interesting founders that I back are focused on the here and now of how do we solve the problem that's like right in front of us, that's immediate, that's affecting so many people. And maybe that's sort of one of the unique things about the American Dynamism practice is that these problems are here right now and we have to solve them as fast as possible.
And to close out, I normally avoid this type of foofy question, but you gave a really great kind of speech at the end of one of your podcasts where you were talking about how like this has the opportunity to give folks like a mission, just like this practice. Like there's a lot of people feel purposeless and don't feel like they really have anything. And within this broad practice, there's a lot that's there for folks. So I'm curious, like what is your articulation of your personal mission within all this?
Yeah. I mean, this is my mission. Like I sounds cheesy, but I love my country so much. I've always loved my country. I've never doubted that. And I think right now there's just so much pessimism, and it's pessimism that I don't think that, you and I experienced when we were growing up. There wasn't sort of this, deep sadness or deep skepticism or deep irony. I mean, it is deep unseriousness about what can be done in this country and what the future will look like. And I just don't hold that belief. I don't believe that things are going to get worse. I do think that we are living in extraordinary times. I do think the people that I get to talk to, and granted, I'm in a very fortunate position in that I get to talk to some of the most brilliant people as a job every day about what the future is going to look like. So I have sort of a rosy, optimistic view that, wow, like the world's going to look incredible. And the thing where I think the disconnect is there's a lot of problems in this country, and I think technologists need to be mindful that we have to solve them. But I'm not pessimistic about what the world's going to look like in 10 years. It's just, and that's the thing where perhaps my mission is just making sure that, more people feel optimism about the future. Like that we are living in the most extraordinary country, and that the future is actually a lot brighter than people think it is. And I think that sounds naive and rosy and optimistic, but again, like that's my universe is optimism. There's no other choice. Like the pessimism is a losing strategy. And if there's anything that people take away from this conversation, it's a losing strategy personally in life. It's a losing strategy in business. It's a losing strategy in technology. Being pessimistic is throwing the towel in before you have to. And so, maybe I'll be the last one clinging on to the optimism, but I hope more people will do so as well.
Very well said. Katherine, thank you so much for joining us again on the Realignment.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always great to be here.